So last week, Johnson released his plans for a new Brexit proposal. We made a video on it to explain its contents and how it brought the Brexit discussion forward. However, when we made that video, the EU hadn't yet had a chance to respond to the deal. So, as I've just got back from holiday, I wanted to cycle back to this issue and discuss what the EU thinks. Before we do that though, I just wanted to encourage you to subscribe to the channel. Looking at the next couple of weeks, we have a lot coming up, and there should be a lot of news for us to unpack. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon in order to stay in the loop. You can also find us across other social networks simply by searching for TLDR News, but of course that's up to you. The EU's opinion on Johnson's Brexit proposal is super important. For any deal to pass, it has to be approved by 4 key groups. Firstly, the UK and EU's negotiators need to sign off on the deal. Then, the UK's Parliament and EU's Parliament need to agree to it too. As you might remember, we went through this approval process with May's deal earlier this year. This deal was approved by both sets of negotiators, which meant that the deal was officially put to each group's respective parliament. It's here, when it made it to the UK's Parliament, that it began to hit real difficulties, with House of Commons rejecting the deal on 3 separate occasions. This effectively killed May's deal, but it doesn't mean that the Commons are the only stumbling block for a deal. Johnson's proposal clearly has the support of the UK government and negotiators, but that still leaves 3 potential pitholes for this proposal. In this video, we're going to discuss the EU's initial reaction to the proposal. If you'd like to hear the other side of the video, whether or not the UK's Parliament are likely to accept it, then like this video and comment down below to let us know. As I mentioned at the beginning, we made a whole video on Johnson's Brexit plan, which is linked below, so here's just 3 sentences of the most basic overview to jog your memory. Johnson proposes having 2 borders. The first border is a customs border between Ireland and the United Kingdom, which would need to check goods to ensure that the right tariffs and taxes were being paid. The second border would be in place for at least 4 years, and it's a regulatory border in order to ensure that the EU's regulations are being followed in the EU and Northern Ireland, and the UK's regulations are being followed in the rest of the UK. Brussels asked the UK to deliver concrete proposals, which contained viable, workable solutions. What the UK actually delivered was draft new protocol on Ireland/Northern Ireland, including a legal text, which, as of the time of recording, the full version hasn't been released. Some in the Prime Minister's camp would argue that this proposal exactly fits the EU's list of requirements, while the EU would argue that the plan still doesn't fully explain how all of this will happen, and leaves a huge number of unanswered questions.
But I think perhaps for the benefit of the House and for people watching, people should be reminded that what the UK has done is already very considerable. We have already moved quite some way, and I hope that our friends and partners across the channel do understand it, and I hope that my right honourable friend understands that as well. We have gone the extra mile. What we are doing both on agri-foods and on goods, with the principle of consent, is, I think, a very considerable move towards compromise.
It's safe to say that the response from the EU was a little muted. In fact, the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, summed it up perfectly by saying that the EU was open but not convinced. Because of this, many EU officials have spent the last few days checking over Johnson's proposal and seeing if they really believe it's possible. One section that people really take issue with are Johnson's proclamations about the customs border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. That being said, Johnson seems very confident that such a border will not be problematic.
I can tell him that absolutely not. That it does not. The proposals we are putting forward do not involve physical infrastructure at or near the border, or indeed at any other place, Mr. Speaker.
Jay Swenson.
Before we continue, it's worth remembering the purpose of this border. This border is supposed to be used to check goods that pass through it, in order to ensure that tariffs, taxes and quotas from the EU and UK are being abided by. That's incredibly important, because if goods can slip through this border, then it fundamentally damages the EU's single market, as well as the UK's ability to enforce taxes and get deals with other countries. That's exactly why countries normally have borders between them. If they aren't members of the same customs union, you need checkpoints between nations in order to ensure that nothing's getting into the country unreported. The issue here is that Ireland and Northern Ireland are intrinsically linked, having been part of the same customs union for many years now. This, plus historic tensions between both sides, mean that suddenly erecting a border between the two is pretty problematic. That's where the backstop came in. The EU and May's government spent months negotiating a backstop arrangement, which will keep the border fairly open while allowing both sides to work independently. The problem was that Johnson and other Brexiteers weren't keen on the solution and voted May's deal down. So now it falls to Johnson to find a new solution, a way that the UK and EU can share a border without it having to be a hard border. As you saw earlier, Johnson says that this can be done without borders, by completing these checks at factories or throughout the supply chain. But the specifics and the technologies that he'd use are yet to be disclosed. So given the importance of this conundrum and the border itself, it's easy to see why some are slightly sceptical about Johnson's light touch plans. Even former Prime Minister Theresa May looked a little confused about how the new Prime Minister was planning on pulling this off. But she wasn't alone in the scepticism, with the Irish Prime Minister also showing concerns from his side of the border. He said that the proposals were welcomed as they allowed both sides to move forward from here, but went on to say that the proposals fell short in a number of aspects. The problem is whether it would even be possible to have a border like this without physical infrastructure and checkpoints on the border. Some believe that technology could solve the problem, but others point out that Johnson's proposal doesn't really explain how he suggests making that work. The Irish perspective got a clear backing from Donald Tusk, with him tweeting, "We stand fully behind Ireland." There's another major issue with the proposal from the EU's perspective, and it's in relation to the second border, the regulatory border. That's because Johnson's plan gives the Northern Irish Assembly the right to essentially veto the whole arrangement. As we mentioned up front, Northern Ireland would continue to follow the EU's rules and regulations, as well as continuing to be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. To make this more palatable to the Northern Irish, Johnson's plan allows them to vote on this every 4 years, allowing them to essentially veto this whole arrangement. On top of this, they also get a veto during the transition period, 6 months before the arrangement would actually be implemented. This might keep the Northern Irish happy, but allowing them to leave without any consultation with the EU is seen as unacceptable to the European Union, and simply is an excuse to allow the DUP to pull Northern Ireland out of the arrangement. It's more than just the border issues though, with some in the EU seeming sceptical that this proposal will actually help to take things forward. Interestingly, not many EU leaders have actually come out to comment on this matter. But Guy Verhofstadt, the European Parliament's Brexit coordinator, has made his stance very clear. And he's someone who really matters in this process. As we said earlier, the UK and EU parliaments both have a veto over the Brexit deal, so his position grants him a lot of influence in the process, even if he's not actively involved in day-to-day negotiations. He said the proposal was mainly just a repackaging of the old proposals that have already been discussed. In fact, Verhofstadt went further than most other members of the EU by saying that the plans were unworkable, suggesting that he didn't even believe that they could be used as a starting point for further negotiations. Some scepticism isn't surprising. No one really thought that the Prime Minister's proposals would be accepted as they were originally presented. They were always meant to be a starting point, where the last weeks of negotiations could be built from. However, the response has proved to be especially troubling for Johnson, presuming he actually wanted to reach a deal in the first place. And that's something not everyone's completely convinced by. As we've discussed a bit before, and can dive into in more detail if you want us to, some believe this offer was more about passing the blame and looking good to the electorate than it was a genuine attempt to make a deal. Guy Verhofstadt was asked if he thought that Johnson was really looking to reach a deal, or if it was just a cynical offer. He said that he had serious doubts about the seriousness of the proposal. He cited a memo between Number 10 and Conservative MPs which had been leaked, telling MPs to immediately blame the European Union. He said that if such a document had really been sent to Tory MPs, you can have doubts about the seriousness of these proposals. Verhofstadt has definitely attempted to encourage the UK to remain, even making an appearance at the Liberal Democrat conference. But this doesn't mean that his views can simply be ignored as the most extreme rhetoric. His Brexit steering group have been fairly relaxed up until now, with the group accepting most proposals and attempting to be helpful. That makes their written response, which criticises the proposal, especially damaging for the UK, especially when you consider how close the BSG are with the negotiating team. No statement like this would emerge without having gone through other parts of the EU, so their views are unlikely to veer too far away from the general consensus. So we seem to be at an impasse once again. Johnson's team think they presented a reasonable starting point. The EU aren't impressed, as they see issues with the deal. In fact, French President told Johnson that he has until the end of the week to come up with a new plan. A French official stated that the president told him that negotiations should continue swiftly with Barnier's team in the coming days, in order to evaluate at the end of the week whether a deal is possible that respects the European Union principles. In the next few days, it should start to become clearer whether or not a deal even looks possible, whether the UK is willing to meet the EU's red lines, whether the EU believes that the UK even wants a deal, and if Johnson can get it through Parliament regardless. We'll continue to keep you updated as this plays out in the coming days, so be sure to subscribe to the channel. You can also hit the bell icon if you want to be notified every time we release a video. And if you want more from us, you can find TLDR across all social networks simply by searching for TLDR News. And if you want your name featured at the end of the videos, just like these people, then you can sign up to back us on Patreon. There's a link to that in the description.